Today, the President of the United States officially nominated Cornell law professor Saule Omarova to be America's top banking regulator. She would be the comptroller of the currency, which is the position from which the office of the comptroller of the currency is the lead regulator of all of our national banks. Now, twice before today, I addressed her nomination on the Senate floor, her then prospective nomination. Now she has been nominated. And I noted that Professor Omarova describes her own views as radical. For example, Professor Omarova has written that she wants to, quote, radically redefine the role of a central bank, end quote. She's also stated that her proposals represent a, and I quote, radical departure from what we've been conditioned to view as the normal state of play, end quote. Madam President, probably the only thing I can think of in all of her writing that I agree with is her characterization of her views as radical. And specifically, let me be clear about what's radical about her whole approach. It's radical because she has a clear and obvious aversion to democratic capitalism itself. In other words, the central organizing principle of American society, that we would be a free society and that would include economic freedom, and economic decisions can be made by free men and women pursuing their own understanding of their self-interest. Instead of that, she has a clear preference for an administrative approach, where decisions are not made by free men and women engaging voluntarily in exchanges, but rather by technocrats who are deemed to know what's better for us than we could possibly know for ourselves. Fact is, in my 11 years in Congress, I don't think I've seen a more radical nominee for any regulatory spot in our entire federal government. And I know that's a bold statement, but I stand by that. Now, last month, I spoke about Professor Omarova's radical plan to have the federal government set prices throughout our economy. She wants the government to decide what people should pay for food and gas and wages and home prices and many other things. That's pretty radical. But today, I want to focus on her radical proposal to nationalize the U.S. banking system. So let me first start by observing that Professor Omarova's plan to nationalize our financial system wasn't something that she wrote decades ago or even years ago. In fact, I believe she wrote it last year, and it was published in the Vanderbilt Law Review just last month. Professor Omarova's radical plan to nationalize financial services was published just last month, and the paper was titled "The People's Ledger, How to Democratize Money and Finance the Economy." The People's Ledger, not the People's Republic, mind you, but the People's Ledger. That's her title for her paper. And in the paper, Professor Omarova outlined her plan to, and I quote, effectively end banking as we know it, end quote. Now, that's a very strong statement. So what exactly does she mean by this? Well, she lays this out for us. In her proposal, the federal government would become the retail bank for every American. That's right. Essentially two features. She would have the creation of retail deposit accounts at the Fed for every American citizen and the issuance of a central bank digital currency to manage this in various ways. The objective of this plan, these are her words, and I quote, the objective is to, quote, reimagine the role of a central bank as the ultimate public platform for generating, modulating, and allocating financial resources in a modern economy, end quote. Think about that. We want the central government to be allocating financial resources in a modern economy. Those are not my words, those are her words. In its role as the, quote, ultimate public platform, end quote, according to Professor Omarova, and I quote, central bank accounts would fully replace rather than uneasily coexist with private bank deposits, end quote. These are her words. She wants to fully replace all of the private accounts that we have. So in other words, if you have a bank account with a local community bank, no more, couldn't have that uneasily, what is her word, uneasily coexisting, that would be replaced. Your money would be with the Federal Reserve instead. So Professor Omarova's view is to put the Fed in charge of handling all of our bank deposits, all of our bank accounts. So when a hardworking American receives their paycheck every week, it doesn't go on direct deposit to the community bank to which you're accustomed to doing business. It will go to a government-controlled bank account with the Fed. Professor Omarova's proposal would, and I quote, envision the complete migration of demand deposits to the Fed's balance sheet, end quote. So lest anyone suggest I'm exaggerating about her plan to replace all banking, these are her words. The complete migration of demand deposit accounts to the Fed's balance sheet. Now, why does Professor Omarova propose that we destroy banking in America and shift all deposit accounts from the innumerable private institutions that we all use and do it all through the Fed? Well, one reason she cites is to empower the Fed to directly distribute fiscal stimulus and aid to worthy beneficiaries. Now, I kind of wonder who the radical left would consider to be sufficiently worthy to be a beneficiary, but that's another whole topic. Another justification that she offers for the Fed to control all retail banking, really for the Fed to be America's sole retail bank, is so that the Fed can more easily control the money supply. This is very interesting. She provides a little insight into how she envisions this because she says this would include, and I quote, implementing a contractionary monetary policy by debiting consumers' accounts. Now, she allows that this could, and I quote, be perceived as the government's taking away people's money, end quote. Well, why would people perceive it as the government taking away people's money? Because that's exactly what she's saying should be an option available to the Fed. So specifically what she's saying is all Americans' deposits must be at the Fed. There can be no private banks. That would be an uneasy coexistence we shouldn't tolerate. And then, if the Fed causes inflation, which is the usual source of inflation, no problem. The Fed can solve the problem by confiscating a little bit of the money from everybody's accounts. Imagine this. That's exactly what she's advocating. The Fed can create inflation, but that's all right. We'll give it a new tool to solve the inflation problem, just confiscate the money from the American citizens who are forced to put their money with the Fed. You can't make this stuff up. This is what she's advocating. That's not the only reason she wants the Fed to be everyone's bank. She says it is to, and I quote, maximize the Fed's capacity to channel credit to productive uses in the nation's economy, end quote. Mr. President, this is the definition of socialist hubris. This is the definition of socialism, the idea that we have the government allocate the resource. Let the government decide what is the productive way to use the resources of our society, rather than individual men and women by virtue of the exchanges they voluntarily choose to engage in. She wants to substitute a centrally managed, planned, socialist economy for the free society that we have today. There's no other way to characterize it. It's this. Where has this ever worked? This is unbelievable. And how does the Fed even, if it were possible, which it's not, how would the Fed decide which are the productive and the non-productive uses in our, what about loans to energy companies? Gee, I don't know, is that productive or is that not productive? Let's leave it to the Fed to decide. What could possibly go wrong? There's another reason why it's a very bad idea to force all Americans to do their retail banking with the central government. It's the end to privacy for Americans' financial transactions. That's over. Now, we remember just weeks ago the tremendous backlash against the idea that banks would be required to report an aggregate transaction information to the IRS. I know I got buried with phone calls and letters. I think we had 16,000 Pennsylvanians who reached out to my office alone urging Congress to reject that proposal. Can you imagine what people will think of Professor Omarova's plan to force you to have your whole bank account with the Fed? Americans don't want the federal government monitoring their bank accounts. I should think that would be obvious. And they certainly don't want the federal government having control over this. So, Mr. President, let me conclude with this. It's perfectly okay for academic institutions and think tanks to have people espousing these socialist ideas and spinning all different variations on these collectivist and centrally planned and socialist themes. Perfectly fine. That should be debated. I'm not in the camp that thinks you cancel someone who has a different point of view from being able to articulate what they believe in. But the idea that we would take someone who holds these socialist views, who is so strongly anti-capitalism, and put that person as the chief regulator of America's banks, that makes no sense at all. I urge my colleagues to oppose this nominee, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.